The lecture hall smelled like recycled air and failure. Cale Doran stood at the front of it with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, somewhere past the 43 cadets arranged in tiered rows before him, somewhere past the reinforced viewport and the cold black slab of space beyond it. He had been talking for 11 minutes. He had not once looked at any of them. Probability, he said. That is the only language the universe speaks. Not hope, not faith, not the poetry you were fed in childhood about stars being the fires of dead gods. He turned to the projection wall, tapped a sequence into the floating interface, and let the numbers bloom across 2 meters of pale light. The statistical likelihood of a Type I civilization having maintained sustained interest in a species at our technological level across the current observable spread of known inhabited systems is 0.0031%. That is not a mystery. That is not an open question awaiting more data. That is a closed door. The only rational response is to catalog, observe, and accept. He turned back. Any questions? One hand went up. Young, earnest, the kind of face that had not yet been worn smooth by years of disappointment. Cadet Olin, second row, top third of the cohort academically. Cale had looked at all their records before the first session, a habit from 15 years of teaching that had not once made the teaching easier. He had the look of someone about to say something Cale had heard 1,100 times. With respect, Commander, couldn't that 0.003 figure change dramatically if we're applying Terran transmission models to species whose communication methods we haven't? No. Olin blinked. Sir, if you'd allow me to. The answer is no, Cadet, and the reason the answer is no is that you're doing the thing every first cycle cadet does, which is allow hope to function as a variable in a calculation where it has no place. Hope is not a unit of measurement. It does not appear in any equation I have ever validated. He closed the projection. You're dismissed. Read Chapter 9 of Heron's contact theory before next session. They filed out. He watched the doorway until the last of them was gone. Then he stood alone in the hall for a long moment, looking at the probability matrix still glowing on the wall. He left it there. It was still accurate. It was still, as far as he could determine, the truest statement about the universe that could be made from where they were standing. He turned off the lights and walked out. He was 38 years old. He had spent 14 years at the Frontier Signals Institute, the last 6 as its senior contact analyst, and in that time he had reviewed 4.7 million discrete anomalous transmissions from across the cataloged sector. Every one of them had resolved into natural phenomena: pulsar interference, gravitational lensing artifacts, the ghost noise of dying stars whose light had been traveling since before the first human city rose and fell. Not one, not a single one, had ever been anything else. He had published this result 3 times, in 3 different peer-reviewed journals, with 3 different methodological frameworks, and every time the conclusion was the same. The universe was very large and very old and very empty of anything that wanted to talk to them. He believed this. He had arranged his entire life around believing it. He walked to his quarters and ate something he didn't taste and sat in the dark for a while, looking at the photographs pinned above his workstation. There were not many of them. A conference in the early years, a group portrait he stood at the edge of, an image of the Keck array taken during a survey run, which he kept not for sentiment but because the resolution was exceptional. A child's drawing of a star, crayoned in yellow on brown paper, the handwriting in the corner that read Papa in uneven block letters, the P reversed as it always is at that age, the whole thing laminated against some long-ago instinct toward preservation that he hadn't examined since. He didn't look at it for long. He turned to the data terminal instead. He had a backlog of 200-plus flagged signals from the last solar month sweep. He opened the first file and began to read. The application arrived in his inbox at 3:40 station time, which was when no sane person was awake, and which was when Cale did most of his best thinking. He almost didn't open it. He had posted the assistant listing 3 months ago as a pure formality. The institute required him to have a research support position filled or lose a quarter of his equipment allocation. A bureaucratic absurdity he had no patience for, but no power to circumvent without a departmental review he had even less patience for. He had expected no applications. His reputation for being difficult to work with had apparently preceded him across at least 4 stations. He had received 2 applications in the first 6 weeks, interviewed neither of them, and quietly let the posting expire and reposted it without advertising it. He was testing a hypothesis. The hypothesis was that no one sensible would apply. There was one. He read it. Then he read it again, more slowly, frowning at the screen in the particular way he frowned when data contradicted his model. The applicant's name was Sira. No family name listed, which was unusual in an official application, and which could mean several things, none of them immediately concerning and all of them mildly interesting. Her education record was fragmented, partial coursework at 3 different institutions across 2 different worlds, none of it in signals analysis or astrophysics or anything that bore the faintest relationship to what he did. What she had studied, such as it was, appeared to be art, comparative language, and something described only as environmental attunement, which was not a field that appeared in any academic registry he could locate in the following 10 minutes. Her employment history was a list of temporary positions on 12 different frontier stations and colony ships, mostly as a translator, occasionally as a cartographer's assistant, once, bafflingly, as a specialist in the acoustic properties of planetary atmospheres. She attached a personal statement. It was 1 paragraph long. I am not a scientist. I do not pretend to be one. But I have spent 11 years moving between worlds, listening to the things in between, and I have learned that the most important discoveries are usually found in the data that trained analysts have already decided to ignore. I work hard. I learn quickly. I will not get in your way. I would like to try. He set the application aside. He went asleep. He woke up, read it again, and hired her, because there was no one else and because, though he did not articulate this even to himself, something in that last paragraph had snagged on something in him that he couldn't immediately locate. It felt, distantly and imprecisely, like the sensation of recognizing a pattern before he knew what the pattern was. She showed up 2 days later at his lab door with a canvas satchel over one shoulder and a small creature tucked under her arm that appeared to be a domesticated atmospheric beetle from the Kellen colony chain, pale green and the size of a fist, whose wings folded flat against its carapace when it slept. She called it Voss. It was, she explained without being asked, her only companion from the last 4 stations and had been with her for 6 years, and she would need to be able to bring it to the lab or the position would not work regardless of other terms. He looked at the beetle. The beetle appeared to look back at him with the mild placidity of a creature that had made its peace with the universe on terms he was not privy to. He told her the beetle could stay. She was slight and dark-haired and had eyes the color of deep water, the kind of still, dark blue color that suggested depth rather than clarity. She looked at everything in his lab, his cluttered workstation, the stacked data cores, the row of photographs above the terminal, the dimensions of the room with a quality of attention that was almost uncomfortable, like watching someone read a room they already knew well. Like she was not discovering the lab but confirming it. You have no background in this work, Cale said. None, she agreed. I don't have time to teach you the basics. You'll be expected to learn from the material itself. That's how I learn best. He studied her for a moment. Why do you want this position? She thought about it. Not in the way people usually thought about interview questions, constructing an answer, but genuinely, as if she was figuring it out in real time, which was either authentic or the most convincing performance of authenticity he'd encountered. And he found, to his mild irritation, that he couldn't immediately determine which. Because I think someone with fresh eyes is useful, she said. Because I've spent 11 years traveling and I'm tired, and this seemed like a place worth stopping. She paused. And because I've heard transmissions from 8 different inhabited systems, and I've never been able to stop wondering what was in the ones nobody caught. We catch them all, Kale said. That's the point. I know, she said, and the way she said it wasn't agreement. It was the specific diplomatic acknowledgement of a position you intend to test. He showed her the workstation he'd set up in the secondary bay, explained the flagging protocols in 20 minutes, gave her 3 months of backlog to start with, and told her he expected documentation on everything she reviewed, no exceptions, format consistent with the Institute's standard which he sent to her terminal. She nodded, sat down, and started working. Voss settled into his habitat on the corner of her desk. She had apparently already arranged one with the facility's office, another thing she had done without going through him, and went to sleep. Kale went back to his own terminal, and for the first 40 minutes kept waiting for her to ask a question. She didn't. She had a bag of small stones. He noticed it that first week. She'd arranged them along the front edge of her workstation in a row, maybe 30 of them, all different textures and colors and densities, placed in what appeared to be a specific order she never altered, and which did not appear to be alphabetical or by size or by any organizational principle he could identify on inspection. When he asked about them, she held one up, a dull rust-red chip, dense, slightly warm to the touch even in a climate-controlled environment. Atmospheric sample capsules, she said. From every world I've spent more than a week on. This one's from Javara. The soil there has high iron oxide saturation. It colors everything. The sky looks like a permanent sunset, even at noon. She set it down carefully, as if it was heavier than it looked. This one's from Meridian Station, which doesn't technically have soil, but there's mineral deposit on the outer hull from 60 years of micrometeorite impact, and I scraped some off before I left. She looked at the whole row. I've been to 12 worlds. I have stones from 11. Which one is missing? Earth. She said it the way people say the names of places they've always intended to visit and somehow never managed, not with regret exactly, but with the awareness of an unfinished thing. I've never made it there. He didn't say anything to that. He turned back to his terminal. What she was, he came to understand over the following weeks, was an observer in a sense that his training had never quite named or accounted for. Not an analyst in any trained sense. She had no formal framework, no hypothesis-testing methodology, no systematic approach to the data that he could diagram or describe. What she had instead was something harder to name and harder to discount. She noticed things. Not in the way automated flagging systems notice things, not in the way pattern recognition algorithms notice things, but in the way a musician notices that something is slightly off rhythm before they can explain why, before the analysis catches up to the perception. She would flag a transmission not because it failed a standard deviation test, but because something about its phrasing bothered her, some quality of spacing or timing or structure that she couldn't articulate precisely but couldn't let go of. More often than not, he would look at what she'd flagged and find a mundane explanation within minutes. Occasionally, he would not. This one, she said one evening, setting a data chip on his workstation without preamble. He was in the middle of a third-pass analysis on a magnetar candidate from the previous quarter. He set it aside and picked up the chip. It was a signal fragment from Sector 7 Kappa, flagged 6 months ago by the automated system, and shelved as a likely magnetar interference artifact, low priority, cleared for archive. Standard procedure, identical to 100 others he'd cleared himself. He looked at the reason she'd pulled it. You noted it has a recurring interval structure, he said. Every 14.3 seconds. Exactly. She leaned over his shoulder to point at the waveform on his screen, close enough that he could smell something that he later cataloged as atmospheric residue, not perfume, but the actual trace of environment she'd passed through, something mineral and cold that was probably Meridian Station's hull compound, and something else, warmer, that he couldn't place. Not approximately exactly, to 4 decimal places. Natural phenomena don't do that. Heartbeats don't do that. Pulsar rotations don't achieve that consistency across that duration without degradation. I've been listening to planetary atmospheres for years, and I know what accidental rhythm sounds like. She straightened. This is not accidental. He looked at it for a long time. He pulled the original source data from the archive. He ran his own analysis, just to be certain she hadn't made an error somewhere in the flagging chain, because it was his job to verify and because he did not, by reflex or training, simply accept another person's observation on its own terms. The result came back the same, 14.3 seconds, every time, locked to a precision that made him sit slightly forward in his chair. It could be a calibration artifact from the relay array, he said. Mechanical resonance can produce false periodicity. I pulled the maintenance records for that relay array. It was serviced 11 days before this signal was captured. No mechanical anomalies reported. She said it without triumph, without "I told you so," just flatly, the way she said most things, as if the information was simply there and his response to it was his own business. "I thought you'd want to know." He pulled the maintenance records himself to confirm. She was right. He told himself it was still probably nothing. It almost certainly was. In 14 years of this work, every anomaly had eventually resolved into nothing. She stayed late, he worked late. There began to be an overlap in their schedules that was not strictly professional, and which produced, over time, a particular quality of shared silence in the lab that he noticed the way he noticed the 14.3-second interval. Not as a warm thing, but as a real thing, a presence that changed the character of the room. She made tea in the lab's small preparation alcove using a process that involved far more steps than the machine required, and produced a result that was distinctly different from machine tea, and she left a cup on his workstation without asking whether he wanted one. He drank it. She found his collection of old audio recordings, Earth music mostly, accumulated over the years from various cultural exchange programs, and the estates of retired colleagues, and a long-ago salvage auction he'd attended on a whim. Music in languages he only half understood, but which had lodged somewhere in his composition that analysis could not access. When she found it and asked if she could listen while she worked, he was briefly wrong-footed in a way that had nothing to do with the question itself. "You like pre-expansion music," he said. "I like old things," she said. She was looking at the archive list on the terminal, scrolling slowly. Old things were made by people who didn't know what came next. There's an honesty in that I find useful. Current things are made in the knowledge of how everything turned out, which makes them retrospective even when they're trying to be present. He told her she could listen. The first thing she played was a recording from Earth, a singer with a voice like gravel and smoke, a guitar and a harmonica and words that moved sideways and never quite resolved into the comfort they seemed to be approaching. A song about something terrible coming and the specific clarity of a person who knew it. She listened to it with her chin in her hand and her eyes closed, and the stones in their row and vase in his habitat, and the whole lab arranged around her as if this was where it had always been pointing. "This man sounds like he knew something terrible was coming," she said when it ended. "He lived in a time when something terrible was coming," Cale said. "Apparently more than one something over several decades." Then he was paying attention. She opened her eyes and looked at the archive list again. "I like him." She found a recording in his archive 2 weeks later, a different song by the same artist, one he didn't have and didn't know existed, and purchased it from a cultural data vendor, and left it in his queue without comment or explanation. He found it at 200 after a session on the Sector 7 Kappa data had run long, and he was sitting in the near dark, and he sat for a long time looking at it in the queue before he played it. The signal from Sector 7 Kappa grew. Not in the sense that it expanded or intensified. It remained what it had been, a narrowband fragment, technically classified as low priority by the Institute's automated systems. But once Kale had looked at it properly, once Sierra had pulled it into focus in that way she had, that was less analysis than revelation, he could not put it back in the archive and leave it there. He began to work on it systematically, methodically, the way he worked on everything, running the interval against every natural phenomenon database he could access, eliminating explanations one by one in the process of scientific elimination. That was the only protocol he trusted. She worked beside him, doing something different, not analysis in his sense but mapping, plotting the signal's apparent origin point against stellar cartography, cross-referencing it against emission profiles from objects in the same region, doing it not with software but with hand-drawn overlays on printed star charts, the kind of old method he hadn't seen used seriously since his doctoral years. "You're doing that by hand," he said one evening, watching her draw a line between two coordinates with the kind of careful attention to precision that belonged to a different century. "I think better this way." She didn't look up. "Data on a screen is data I observe. Data on paper that I've physically drawn is data I remember differently. My old cartography supervisor used to say the map maker's hand knows things the cartographer's mind hasn't caught up to yet. That's not epistemologically sound." "No," she said, still drawing. "It works anyway." It was a Thursday when the deep array results came back. He had submitted a request to Dr. Rael Vance at Station Caddoon, the Institute's allied facility, for observation time on their long-range array, the kind of instrument that could resolve the signal's composition well enough to determine whether it was carrying structured information. Getting that time had required more navigation than the analysis, because Vance was territorial about her instruments, and because Kale's official standing at the Institute had been quietly reduced following the publication dispute 3 years earlier, when a rival team had submitted his data under their own names, and the Institute's review board had found in their favor in a decision that Kale still considered the most cynical act of institutional cowardice in his professional lifetime. He had tried to make the call himself. The call had not gone well. He had explained the situation to Vance's administrative assistant in precise technical language and been put on hold twice, and then referred to a scheduling committee that met quarterly. Sierra made the call. She sat in front of the communications panel while Kale stood behind her, and she talked to the assistant in 2 different languages in the first 5 minutes. The station's administrative common and what sounded like a Caddoon colonial trade dialect, warm and informal, the kind of register that moved sideways around official processes and went directly to the part of a person that wanted to be useful. She asked about the assistant's name, used it immediately, asked how the transition to the new scheduling interface was going, commiserated about administrative systems in the particular way that made people feel heard rather than processed. By the end of the call, they had a priority observation window booked on the deep array for the following week. He watched her sign off and sit back in her chair. "You speak Caddoon dialect," he said. "I worked there for 4 months on a survey vessel." She turned in her chair. "You speak 3 registers of technical common and nothing else, don't you? Languages are learned at the expense of other cognitive bandwidth. I made a choice." "You made a choice," she agreed without judgment. "I made a different one." The deep array results came back on a Tuesday morning. He was already at his terminal when the data packet arrived. He had been at his terminal since 1:30, technically, which was not unusual. He opened the packet with the practiced calm of someone who had trained himself over many years to manage the distance between anticipation and outcome. He had done this for 14 years. He was very good at it. He looked at the signal composition analysis. He read it once. He read it again, more slowly, aware that something in his breathing had changed without his having authorized the change. He walked across the lab to where Sierra was sitting and placed the data slate in front of her without saying anything. She read it. She was quiet for a moment. Voss stirred in his habitat. It's structured, she said. Yes. That's not, she stopped. Read it again. That's not a natural structure. No. She looked up at him. Her eyes were very clear and very still, the way they went when she was paying the most attention. Kale. We need the supplementary orbital data, he said, to confirm the source object's parameters. If the structure corresponds to an object maintaining a non-decaying orbit around that exoplanet, that would mean something is maintaining it. Yes. Actively. Yes. She looked back down at the data. Outside the viewport, that section of space looked the same as it had always looked: distant, silent, apparently indifferent. It was none of those things. She picked up the rust-red stone from Javara and turned it in her fingers once. Then she set it down. I have a theory I've never been able to convince anyone to take seriously, she said. What is it? That the universe isn't empty, that it's quiet in a way that looks like empty to people who have decided in advance what they're listening for. She looked at the data on the slate. I think this is one of those silences. The kind that was waiting for someone to stop performing certainty long enough to actually hear it. He did not argue with her. He wasn't sure, for the first time in a considerable span of time, that he was in a position to. They needed the orbital database. The specific stellar survey data from Sector 7 Kappa was locked behind a research access tier that Kale no longer held, a bureaucratic consequence of the publication dispute that he had never successfully appealed. He knew where the data was physically stored. He knew the access protocols. He had designed some of them years ago when he'd still held a role in the Institute's systems architecture. So don't go through the official channel, Sira said. That's not. You know the facility layout. You know the access sequences. You know which corridors are checked at what intervals because you designed the original security rotation schedule. She had pulled up a schematic on her personal terminal without him noticing. We go after second shift rotation, access the archive node, and we're out in 20 minutes. He looked at her. She looked back. There was something in her expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the space adjacent to one. A patience that was not patience in the passive sense, but in the sense of someone who has already run the calculation and found the outcome acceptable and is waiting for him to arrive at the same place. This is not how I operate, he said. The way you operate hasn't accessed that data yet, she said. This will. They went after second shift rotation. She moved through the corridors with a fluency that he found himself watching, quiet and unhurried, orientating without obvious reference to the schematic, making choices at junctions without hesitation in the way that people who are genuinely comfortable in unfamiliar spaces move, which was the opposite of how Kale moved in spaces that weren't his lab. He followed her, feeling both faintly absurd and, somewhere beneath the absurdity, something that he would have had difficulty naming, but which had to do with the sensation of being outside his own patterns in the company of someone who was not. They reached the archive node. He accessed it, pulling the orbital survey data in 6 minutes. They were in the corridor on the way out when a security sentry came around the far corner. Kale saw him first and stopped. Sira didn't stop. She kept walking, and as she passed him she began talking Kadun dialect again, warm and casual and entirely unremarkable, the tone of someone who had every right to be in this corridor and was more interested in talking to this particular person than in being anywhere else. She asked about the ventilation maintenance that had apparently been happening on this level. She'd heard it was making the air quality inconsistent. Was that what they'd found? The sentry nodded, said something about the calibration on the secondary recirculation units and moved on. He never looked at Kale. They walked back to the lab. They were almost to the door before Kale realized his heart rate had not returned to baseline. He was not sure when it had deviated. He put the orbital data into his analysis queue. He ran the primary confirmation. He ran the secondary confirmation and the tertiary, because he was Kale Doran and that was how he worked, and the tertiary came back identical to the first two. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The object was real. It was artificial. It had been placed in a non-decaying orbit around a planet in Sector 7 Kappa, and something was actively maintaining that orbit against the gravitational perturbations that should have degraded it over the centuries that the survey data spanned. Not natural. Genuinely, verifiably, not possible by natural means. Something had built it. Something was keeping it there. And from it came the signal with the 14.3-second interval that a woman with no scientific training, and a bag of stones, and an excellent ear for what was accidental, had noticed in a pile of discarded data 6 months ago. Sierra was standing behind his chair. He turned and looked at her, and neither of them said anything immediately, because some discoveries require a moment of silence that isn't emptiness but the opposite of emptiness, a fullness too large for immediate language. "We found it," he said. He heard the word "we" and did not revise it. "We found something," she said, and her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before, something that was wonder and grief at the same time. "We don't know what it is yet. We know what it means." She was quiet. Outside the viewport, the star field was unchanged. He was already rewriting it in his mind, not empty, not silent, not closed. The door he had been telling students for 6 years was shut was open, and had been open, and the question he had been teaching as a closed question was not closed. He was aware that this revision was going to require more than a moment. "You should eat something," she said. "You've been working for 16 hours. Sierra." "I know," she said, and the "I know" carried the weight of knowing what was happening, and having known it was possible and feeling both of those things at once. "Eat. Then we figure out the next step." She handed him a nutrition packet from her satchel. He ate it without tasting it. He had not noticed the changes incrementally, which was how he knew they were significant. He was trained to notice increments, so missing them meant the change was happening at a level below his observation. She was slower in the mornings. She left earlier. There were days she arrived before him and the quality of her presence in the lab when he walked in was different, reduced in some way that was not about her concentration or her attention, which remained precise, but about the physical reserves she was drawing on to maintain them. He worked faster. He was not, in any honest accounting, sure whether this was for the work or for her, or whether that distinction was as clean as he was treating it. She told him on a Thursday afternoon while they were waiting for a data confirmation to run, with Voss settled on her shoulder, and the row of stones on the workstation, and the projection of Sector 7 Kappa spinning slowly in the corner. She put her hands flat on the table, which he had learned was how she handled conversations she expected to be difficult, and she told him plainly. Autoimmune cascade, systemic, multiple organ involvement. The last medical assessment had given her 3 to 6 months, she said, though she noted that assessment had been 4 months ago and she'd been here instead of going back, and she was not entirely sure what that meant now. He stared at her. "You didn't tell me," he said. "It wasn't information you needed to do the work," she said. "And I didn't want you to hold back from what we were building." "Sierra." "I can still work," she said. "I intend to work as long as I'm able to. That is what I want to do. I'm telling you now because I think you'd prefer to know." She looked at him steadily. "And because I think you're someone who processes things better with full information, even when the full information is difficult." He didn't know what to do with that, which was an accurate description of his relationship to most of the significant information in his life, but which had never felt as stark as it did in this particular moment. He was not good at being present for other people's difficult things. He had arranged his life to minimize the frequency with which this was required of him, and he recognized, sitting across from her, that this arrangement had served him poorly in ways he had been calling rationality. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Nothing different than what I have. A pause. Company sometimes, not to talk, just someone else in the room, knowing the room isn't empty. I'm generally in the room, he said. I know, she said. That's why I said sometimes. He went through Vance directly now. Using what remained of a professional reputation he'd spent 14 years accumulating. Vance agreed to everything he asked after she looked at the data, which happened to be the same sequence of events that had happened with everyone who looked at the data with full attention. First skepticism, then careful attention, then silence, then complete cooperation. He made the formal submission through the Colonial Contact Authority and the Institute's official Discovery Channel, both at once, a process that required 3 days of documentation that Sierra helped him compile in the evenings when her energy was higher. She told him he had to go to the press conference. Not because she was sentimental about spectacle. She said it without sentiment, practically, the way she said most things, but because this was the result of 14 years of work, and she thought he should be present in his own life when the thing he'd worked toward arrived. You've spent 14 years telling people the door was closed, she said. You should be in the room when it opens. He went. He sat in the back, away from the official panel table where Vance and the Institute directors and the Colonial Contact Authority representative were arranged in their careful hierarchy of visibility. He watched them present the data. He watched the room receive it, the particular silence that falls when 100 people in a room stop performing their professional composure and allow themselves to understand what they're hearing. He did not experience any of this with the gratification he might have expected. He was thinking about a rust-red stone and a man who knew something terrible was coming, and a woman who heard the silence between transmissions and called it, correctly, a form of speech. He was not at the lab when her condition deteriorated. He was in a meeting because of course he was, because that is how these things go. The critical moments arrive in the gaps between the institutional machinery, not when you've arranged yourself to receive them. He got the notification and left the meeting without explanation, and went to the medical facility and sat beside the bed in the way he had sat beside terminals for 14 years, still, focused, not performing any emotion he did not feel. He felt something. He felt it the way she had described her illness, not as an event but as a progressive reduction, something that had been building in the ordinary moments until the ordinary was no longer recognizable. She was conscious, barely. The room was white and quiet and had the particular stillness of medical spaces, the kind of stillness that has been deliberately maintained and which therefore has a slightly hollow quality. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, she said. Her voice was quiet and even. I thought it might change how you worked with me. I didn't want that. I worked with you the same, he said. I know. Her eyes were still the same color, deep water still. I know you did. She turned her head toward the window. There was a section of dark sky visible through it, and Cale happened to know, because he always knew the approximate coordinates of what was visible from where he was standing, that this section corresponded within about 3 arc minutes to the general direction of Sector 7 Kappa. He did not know if she knew this or if it was coincidence. He was no longer certain with her which category coincidence belonged to. Tell me something true, she said. He had spent 14 years knowing things. He had an accurate, verified, peer-reviewed accounting of most of the things that could be known from where he was standing. None of them were what he wanted to say. You changed how I hear things, he said. I listen differently now than I did before you. I don't think that stops when you're gone. I think it stays, in the form it takes when something that was added doesn't leave even after the person who added it does. She was quiet for a moment. Good, she said, and then very softly, her eyes moving back toward the window, I wish I could see your face when you see it. See what? She was asleep. She died at 4:40 station time. He was there. He did not work for 3 days. which was the longest consecutive period he had not worked since his son died. He sat in the lab on the second day in his own chair and looked at the row of stones on her workstation. 11 stones, 11 worlds. The 12th place in the row was empty. It had always been empty. He looked at that empty place for a long time. Voss made sounds from his habitat that Kale had no framework to interpret and which he chose, in the absence of better information, to call grief. On the third day he came back to work. He ran through the data queue with the same methodical attention he had applied for 14 years, flagging, dismissing, documenting. He worked through the whole day and into the evening. He did not play any music. He worked in silence, and he was aware of the silence differently than he had been before, in the way that a room sounds different when someone who used to be in it is not. He was in his 18th hour, near midnight, when he stopped. He had pulled the Sector 7 Kappa files back up, not to analyze them, he told himself, just to look at them, which was a distinction he didn't entirely believe, but chose not to examine. He was looking at the waveform he now knew was artificial, the signal that had traveled 200 light-years and arrived in his archive as a low-priority artifact, and sat there for 6 months until a woman with no scientific training and a bag of stones and an ear for the spaces between things pulled it into the light. And in the waveform he had looked at for months, he saw something he had not noticed before, something that existed not in the signal's main interval but in the shape of its carrier wave, in a modulation pattern that was not natural and was not noise, and was not any category his classification systems had been built to identify. It was new. It had not been there the last time he'd reviewed the raw transmission. It had arrived in the most recent data refresh, 2 months ago, which he hadn't examined because the 7 Kappa discovery had been officially submitted, and he had filed it in the completed category and moved to the next thing. He ran it through every cipher and encoding template in his full database, which took 40 minutes. He ran it through 3 different contact linguistics models, the ones built by the Institute's theoretical team over the last 2 decades, based on 17 different probability models for what alien communication structures might look like. He ran it through an amateur decoding suite he'd used as a doctoral student and never quite deleted, the kind of old tool that sometimes sees things current tools have been optimized past. At 200, he sat back in his chair with his hands over his face. His name, his full name, in Morse code, a human encoding system developed on Earth in the mid-19th century, the kind of foundational signal architecture that had been transmitted into the wider universe in a dozen different forms over the last 2 centuries of humanity's radioactive existence, something an alien intelligence monitoring human communications would have encountered in the earliest signal sweeps. His name, rendered with the precision of an entity that had learned the system and applied it correctly, not a mathematical sequence, not a universal greeting, his name. They had been listening. For 2 years since the press conference, since humanity had formally announced itself across the frequency spectrum, they had been listening and they had learned, and they had decided to respond in the most direct way possible. They had found the person who had found them, and they had called him by name. He sat in the dark for a long time. He had no template for what he was feeling, and he did not attempt to construct one. Then, at 2:37, a second transmission resolved from the same source, different carrier frequency, different format, a compressed audio file that took the decoding system 17 minutes to assemble. He waited. He was very still. He had spent 14 years being very still in front of data, and he was still now in a way that was different from all those previous times, because he was no longer certain what the data was going to do. The file finished assembling, he played it. A voice like gravel and smoke, a guitar, a harmonica, words that moved sideways and never quite resolved into the comfort they approached. A hard rain, a man who was paying attention, A song from a world 200 light-years away played back to him across the silence by something that had heard it somehow in the signal drift of a species it was learning. He did not move. He sat in the dark of the lab, and the data terminal's light played across the row of stones on the workstation next to his. The rust-red one from Javara, the gray-white one from Meridian Station, 11 stones from 11 worlds, and the empty space where the 12th one would have been, and the music played all the way through without stopping. He thought about what she had said, about atoms not disappearing but changing state, about grief being unresolved energy, about the universe not being empty but quiet in a specific and deliberate way. He thought about a woman who knew how to listen to quiet and who had died before she could hear what the quiet had been building toward. He thought about the last thing she said. "I wish I could see your face when you see it." He reached across to her workstation and picked up the rust-red stone from Javara, the first one she'd shown him, dense and slightly warm. He turned it over in his palm. There is a particular human gesture that is very old, older than language, older than signal theory, older than every framework Cale Doran had built his professional life within. It is the gesture of pressing your hand to your mouth when something large arrives without warning, and your body needs a moment to receive it before your mind can. He made that gesture. He did not analyze it. He let it happen. The tears came the way they always do when they've been waiting a long time, not dramatically, not as release, but as the quiet completion of something that had been building since long before this particular moment. He sat in his lab with a stone from an orange-skied world in his hand, and a song from Earth playing from the direction of a star 200 light-years distant, and he cried for a woman who had died knowing the door was open when she could not step through it, and for a child whose drawing was still pinned above his terminal, and for 14 years of telling students and colleagues and himself that the door was closed when it had been open all along. When the answer had been sitting in the archive, waiting for someone to stop being certain long enough to hear it. The song ended. The lab was quiet. Outside the viewport, the stars held their distances. He straightened in his chair. He looked at the data terminal with its impossible, generous, specific gift. A signal that had crossed 200 light-years to arrive in this room and say his name, to play back a song he'd shared with a woman who was gone, to demonstrate that something out there had learned to pay attention in the way she had tried to teach him. Something that had learned that the way to say hello to a grieving scientist in a quiet lab was not with mathematics or universal constants, but with music, with the specific human artifact of a voice like gravel and smoke and words that moved sideways. He said 2 words to the empty room. "Thank you." He meant them for more than one person and for more than one thing. He meant them for the origin point of the signal, and for the woman who had heard it first, and for the universe itself, which had, it turned out, not been indifferent to them, which had been, in whatever way things that large can be said to be anything, paying attention. He sat for a while longer, until the sky outside the viewport had begun its slow turn toward the artificial morning. The station cycled through every 22 hours. Then he picked up the data slate and began writing the follow-up submission, methodically, in precise technical language, with the careful documentation of a man who knew how to make evidence legible, and who intended this particular evidence to outlast every doubt anyone would bring to it. He paused once, partway through, and looked at the row of stones. He looked at the empty place at the end. He thought about Earth. He thought about a woman who had been to 12 worlds and had stones from 11, who had spent 11 years moving between places and listening to the things in between, who had never made it there, and had carried that unfinished thing with her all the way to the end. He thought about the particular quality of an unfinished thing, how it is not the same as a loss but something more like a standing invitation, a direction that remains open even when the person who held it is gone. He made a note in his personal log, not in the official file. He would go to Earth. He would bring a stone back. He would put it at the end of the row. Then he went back to writing the submission, and the signal from Sector 7 Kappa pulsed on at its exact, unwavering 14.3-second interval, as it had been pulsing for longer than anyone yet knew, patient and specific, and entirely unlike nothing. Outside the viewport, the stars held their distances and their silences and their patient, ancient fires. Somewhere among them, something was still listening and had been all along, and had found them worthy of a name. 43 cadets were waiting for him the following week. He stood at the front of the lecture hall with his arms at his sides this time, not crossed, and looked at them in a way he had not looked at a room of students in longer than he could cleanly account for. He looked at Cadet Olin in the second row, who had his data slate ready, and his expression arranged in the careful neutrality of a student who had learned not to expect warmth from this particular instructor. Cale stood there for a moment in the silence of the lecture hall, and thought about a woman who had told him that some knowledge is located in the body's relationship to the world, and that the universe's quiet could look like emptiness to people who decided in advance what they were listening for. He opened his mouth. "Last session I told you the door was closed," he said. "I was wrong." He let that sit. Not in the sloppy way, not in the emotional way. I was wrong in the specific, verifiable, data-supported way that is the only kind of wrong that matters in this work. He moved to the projection wall. "This is the signal from Sector 7 Kappa." He brought up the waveform. "This is the interval, 14.3 seconds exactly to 4 decimal places, for the entire duration of our observation window. This is the orbital confirmation data showing an object maintaining non-decaying orbit through active correction." He turned from the wall. "And this is the follow-on transmission." He played it, just the carrier pattern, not the music, not yet, because some things were not yet ready for an audience. This arrived 6 months after the official discovery announcement. It contains structured information. It is addressed, specifically by name, to a member of this research institution. The room was very still. Olin's hand had not gone up yet. His mouth was slightly open. "I spent 14 years running probability calculations," Cale said. "Calculations were correct. The data was correct. The methodology was correct. What was wrong was the question I was asking the data to answer." He stood at the front of the room and looked at them, the young faces, the earnest faces, the faces that still had room in them for surprise. "The question I was asking was, is there anything out there that wants to communicate with us? And the answer to that question, according to everything I reviewed, was probably not. That conclusion was accurate." He paused. "The question I should have been asking was, is there anything out there that is already communicating that we haven't learned to hear yet? And the answer to that question is different." Olin's hand went up. "What's the difference," he said, "between those two questions?" Cale looked at him. He thought about a woman with a bag of stones and an ear for the spaces between transmissions and a row of small monuments to the worlds she'd passed through. He thought about the patience it takes to listen without already knowing what you're listening for. "Everything," he said. "The difference is everything." He turned back to the projection wall. "Chapter 9 of Heron is suspended for this session. We're going to talk about what we actually know." He talked for 40 minutes. He answered questions for another 30. He answered Olin's questions last because Olin's questions were, in fact, the most interesting, which was not something he had planned to say aloud, and which produced a visible effect in Olin's expression that Cale found, unexpectedly and without precedent in his recent history, something he could only describe as good. He went back to the lab after the session ended. He sat at his workstation and pulled up the Sector 7 Kappa file and opened it to the part he looked at last. Every time, not the interval waveform, not the orbital data, not the official discovery submission with its careful documentation. The audio file. The song that had traveled 200 light years because something had heard it and understood that it mattered, that this specific artifact from this specific species was not incidental noise but signal, was not background but foreground, was a thing they valued and therefore a thing worth returning. He played it. Voice like gravel and smoke, guitar and harmonica, words that moved sideways and never quite resolved into the expected comfort. A hard rain, somewhere between a prophecy and a benediction. A man who had paid attention to the world he was in when the world was difficult to pay attention to. Cale listened to it all the way through, the way he had begun to do every evening, not as analysis, not cataloging or documenting, but simply listening because he had learned, late and from the best possible teacher, that listening was itself a form of work, that attention was itself a kind of signal, that the universe responds to being taken seriously in ways that probability theory has not yet fully modeled. The song ended. The lab was quiet in the way it was always quiet now, not the old emptiness that had once lived in the quiet, but something fuller, something that had been added and which, as he had told her, did not leave when the person who added it was gone. He looked at the row of stones. He looked at the empty place at the end. He began planning the trip to Earth. It would take 3 months in transit, round trip, and he had never been good at being away from his instruments for that long, and there were a dozen legitimate reasons to delay it. He noted each of the legitimate reasons and set them aside. He had spent enough years letting legitimate reasons accumulate into the shape of a life he hadn't chosen. He booked the transit. Outside the viewport, the stars held their positions with their usual ancient patience, and in one particular sector of the sky, in the direction of a small orange dwarf star 200 light-years distant, a signal pulsed at 14.3 seconds exactly, and the device that generated it maintained its non-decaying orbit as it had for centuries before any human hand had reached far enough to notice it, and something on the other end of that signal was paying attention. Had been paying attention, had learned to say one human name in the oldest human code, and to send back through the dark a song about a hard rain that was coming, because someone had played that song in a quiet room while they were learning what they were dealing with. And whatever was listening had understood that the song was not background. The song was the point. The care was the point. The attention was the point. The woman who had heard what no one else was hearing, who had walked through 12 worlds with a bag of stones, and an absence of formal training, and an excess of the quality that formal training most consistently fails to produce. She had been the point, in the way that the specific and irreplaceable person is always the point, in the way that the universe, vast and old and frequently indifferent, occasionally turns out to have been paying attention to exactly that. The signal pulsed on. Cale Doran, senior contact analyst, who had spent 14 years teaching students that the door was closed, sat in the quiet of his lab and looked at an empty space on a workstation, and understood that some things that look like endings are not endings, but the specific shape that continuations take when the person you shared them with is gone. He would go to Earth. He would bring a stone back. He would put it at the end of the row. And the door would stay open.